Now to local and African news. And we begin on a very positive note. Nigeria's gross domestic product grew by 5.01% in the second quarter of 2021, the highest economic growth recorded under the Muhammadu Buhari administration in 6 years. The National Bureau of Statistics, in its Quarter 2 GDP report, said the 5.01% growth rate recorded year on year was higher than the 6.1% growth recorded in Quarter 2 of 2020 and the 0.51% recorded in Quarter 1 of 2021. The NBS said the GDP figure was indicative of the return of business and economy activity levels seen prior to the nationwide implementation of COVID-19 restrictions.
Joining us now to speak on what this cheering news means for the economy is Johnson CHUKWU, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of COWRY Asset Management Company. Good morning.
Good afternoon, Hawa and Ekene.
Yes.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So the economy is growing. This is good news for everyone.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's actually a piece of cheering news for every Nigerian and everyone interested in the Nigerian economy, given where we're coming from. Like you rightly pointed out, the economy actually contracted last year, by this time last year, by about 6.1%. And if you compare that contraction to a growth of about 5.01%, that is quite huge. So we're actually coming out of a situation where the economy was locked down completely by the second quarter of 2020. But now we are seeing gradual or almost normalization of economic activities. Virtually all sectors of the economy have been reopened, unlike what we had in the second quarter of last year. And that's why we saw the growth or the recovery in the GDP by as high as 5.01%. But I must sound a cautious note at this point so that we don't carry it away. This growth of 5.01% was partly as a result of what we call base effect. And I will explain what base effect means. If you cast your mind back to what I said just earlier, that the economy contracted by 6.1% in the second quarter of last year. And what we are doing now, we are measuring economic activities in the second quarter of 2021 to economic activity in the second quarter of 2020. And the economic activity in the second quarter of 2020 was a contraction, went into a trough. So what we're doing now, we're coming out of that trough. And that's why you are seeing this magnitude of growth. It's not as if the economy is really expanding. Of course, you can see it's a reasonable level of growth, but we need to sustain.
Mr. CHUKWU, you were explaining the reason and saying we should be cautious not to become too optimistic or too celebratory yet, because the contrast was to do with last year's shrinkage and this year's emergence of the market. But I want to say that people are hardly likely to get carried away until they see it reflected in their pockets. And as yet, we're still feeling the pinch of inflation. When we go to the markets, the prices are up, no end. So I just want to ask, maybe if we analyze the situation, we can get a sense of where this growth is coming from. We understand that the chemical and pharmaceutical sector seem to be carrying the economy. How is this so?
Well, it is one of those that recorded the fastest growth in the second quarter of this year. But its weight in terms of contribution to the GDP is not so significant. So if you really look at those sectors that are driving this growth, one of which in terms of contribution is the ICT sector, the information and telecommunications sector, which grew by about 5.5% and accounts for about 17.92% of the GDP. So that has the material impact. And that sector that is contributing positively is the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector accounts for almost 9% of the GDP and grew by about 3.49%, almost 3.5%. So those sectors that are actually huge in terms of contribution to the GDP, you need to look at the impact, whether they are growing or not. But another area of concern to me is the agricultural sector. Of course, we should know, because when you made allusion that people want to see the impact on their pockets, you have to look at what's happening to the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector's growth is actually consistently slowing down. In the fourth quarter of last year, it grew by about 3.41%. First quarter of this year, it grew by about 2.28%, only to grow by only 1.3% in the second quarter of this year. And the agricultural sector accounts for about 23% of the GDP. So for the average person on the street, the agricultural sector is so important because it has a huge impact on inflation. Because the food inflation factor is driven by our crop production or the extent of growth in the agricultural sector. We actually growing more food items. So until that agricultural sector begins to expand significantly, you're not going to see that translate into improvement in the standard of living average in Nigeria, because that's what will drive that inflation. But concerns are that we're seeing a slowdown in a sector that accounts for almost 1/4 of the GDP. And if we don't arrest it, it has the effect of pulling the GDP back into a negative. Because should agriculture go into a negative, the weight of agriculture in the economy could drive the economy back into a negative. And what's the reason for this slowdown in the agricultural sector? Despite a lot of funding going into that sector, it's because of the level of insecurity, which, I mean, you just, when you lost connection with me, you just went back to what's happening in Jos. And that's, I think, Jos North, which is urban area. You can imagine what's happening in the rural areas where people are being killed and not being reported. So you have displacement of farmers from their farming zones of homes. So, and that's driving that agricultural production. You saw what happened in NDA. You know what's happening in Zamfara State. We need to address that to sustain this growth of 5.01%, because if agriculture goes into negative, its weight will drag down the economic growth in the country.
And it makes sense why the agricultural sector seems to be suffering, the shrinkage it's suffering. But what about crude oil? Because crude oil, similar to the agricultural sector, is said to be down as well.
Well, two things are impacting crude oil production. If you look at the figures as announced by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, crude oil production has dropped from second quarter of last year. Crude oil production was average of 1.81 million barrels a day. At the end of the second quarter of this year, it's on average only 1.61 million barrels a day. So you saw a reduction of about 200,000 barrels daily production. It could be two factors. One, we've seen increase in the bridging of a crude oil transportation facilities in the Niger Delta. Two is that we also have to abide by OPEC quota, which has limited our production. So if you consider the fact that we have a reduction in production because of bridges of crude pipelines, particularly in the Niger Delta, and then you have to abide by crude oil production limits. So that has constrained our crude oil production. But if you even look at the quarter two figure, I think it was more as a result of breaches of crude oil pipelines that we recorded in the second quarter of this year, because we've also seen an expansion in OPEC quota across all member countries. So we need to address, because if you don't address that, you, of course, good thing, crude oil accounts for less than 8% of the GDP today, but it has a very material impact on our foreign exchange earnings and federal government revenue. It accounts about 90% of foreign exchange earnings revenue and about 70% of federal government revenue. 90% of foreign exchange earnings, 70% of federal government revenue. And so that will show you the magnitude of the importance of crude oil if we don't address the gradually evolving restiveness in the Niger Delta.
All of these are very important key points to keep in mind. In conclusion, what can be further done to encourage growth within this sector?
Well, let's look at key sector the government can drive up. One is the agricultural sector that I said account for about 22 to 23% of the GDP. We need to address the issue of insecurity to restore growth in that sector. We've seen consistent 3 quarters of slowdown in growth in the agricultural sector. Two, the ICT sector, which for me is a sector the government should be very interested in. But unfortunately, some of the policies are working against it. We've seen a 900 billion naira tax obligation imposed on DSTV. And those things will encourage investment in that sector.
Yeah, we may have to stop you there. It looks like someone needs you as well on the phone. But thank you so much for making the time for us on Newsday. Mr. Johnson CHUKWU, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of COWRY Assets Limited.